Some masterpieces aren't ruined by darkness. They become unforgettable because they survived it. The first time I saw Adrian Vaughan, I wasn't looking at him. I was looking at a 17th century oil painting worth more than every apartment I had ever lived in combined. My fingertips hovered inches above the cracked varnish as I studied the delicate fractures spreading across the canvas like frozen lightning. Every scar told a story. Every imperfection had earned its place through time. That was what I loved about restoration. You never erased history. You simply helped it breathe again. My name is Claire Bennett, and at 27 years old, I had built a quiet life restoring beautiful things that everyone else believed were beyond saving. Old paintings. Forgotten heirlooms. Broken frames. It was safer than restoring people. They always found new ways to break your heart. The Grand Ashcroft Gallery stood in the center of Manhattan like a cathedral built for wealth instead of faith. Crystal chandeliers scattered warm light across polished marble floors while conversations floated through the room in practiced whispers. Men adjusted tailored tuxedos that probably cost more than my annual rent. Women carried themselves with effortless elegance, their diamonds catching the light every time they laughed. I had borrowed my black evening dress from my closest friend. It fit well enough that nobody noticed it wasn't mine. At least I hoped they didn't. My silver brooch rested against my left shoulder, small enough to escape attention, old enough to belong somewhere else entirely. I had owned it for as long as I could remember. The floral design had faded over the years, leaving only tiny engraved vines wrapping around a pale blue stone. Every foster home. Every apartment. Every city. Somehow it had always stayed with me. I touched it whenever I felt nervous. Tonight my fingers found it more often than usual. "Miss Bennett," the curator called softly. "The donors will be arriving any minute." I nodded and forced a smile. "The painting is stable. I'll finish the remaining restoration after the exhibition closes." "Excellent." They specifically requested to meet the conservator responsible for bringing it back to life. I almost laughed. Nobody wanted to meet me. They wanted to meet the success story attached to the artwork. I simply happened to be standing nearby. The music shifted as the ballroom doors opened. Conversation slowed almost instantly. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was something quieter. Stranger. The kind of silence that appears only when someone important enters without asking for attention because attention belongs to them already. Curious, I looked toward the entrance. A tall man stepped inside wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit. His dark hair was neatly combed back, revealing calm gray-blue eyes that moved across the gallery with quiet confidence instead of arrogance. Security didn't surround him. They followed at a respectful distance. The guests greeted him carefully, almost instinctively leaving space wherever he walked. Nobody introduced him. Nobody needed to. Even before someone whispered his name beside me, I somehow knew. Adrian Vaughan. His gaze traveled across priceless sculptures, antique furniture, and paintings valued in the millions without lingering on any of them. Then, unexpectedly, his eyes found me. The room continued moving around us, but everything inside me became perfectly still. His expression didn't change. Not until his attention drifted to the small silver brooch resting against my shoulder. In that single heartbeat, all the color disappeared from his face. He stopped walking. The glass of sparkling water in his hand remained perfectly steady, yet something behind his eyes shattered so quietly that no one else seemed to notice. I had never seen a stranger look at me as though he had just found a ghost. I should have looked away. Every instinct I had developed after years of working around priceless collections told me never to stare at a guest, especially one who clearly carried the kind of influence that made entire rooms adjust their breathing. Yet I could not explain why his reaction unsettled me more than his reputation ever could. His expression had not been fear. It had not even been surprise. It was recognition. Impossible, immediate recognition. My hand drifted toward the silver brooch pinned to my dress before I even realized I was moving. The cool metal rested beneath my fingertips like it always had, familiar enough to calm my nerves on difficult days, ordinary enough that I had never questioned its origin beyond the simple story my adoptive mother had told me. She had said it came with me. Nothing more. Nothing less. Miss Bennet? The curator's cheerful voice pulled me back into the gallery. There is someone I would like you to meet. I turned just as Adrian Vaughn began walking in my direction. He did not rush. He did not hesitate. Every measured step echoed softly across the marble floor while conversations faded into distant background noise inside my head. Up close, he looked younger than I expected, perhaps 32, with the composed face of someone who had spent years teaching himself that emotions belonged behind locked doors. His gray-blue eyes remained fixed on the brooch instead of my face. I suddenly became aware of every heartbeat inside my chest. Miss Bennet, the curator said proudly, this is Mr. Adrian Vaughn, the primary benefactor behind tonight's exhibition. Adrian extended his hand. His voice, when he finally spoke, was calm enough that nobody nearby could have guessed anything was wrong. It is a pleasure to meet you. I accepted the handshake. His grip was firm without trying to prove anything. Thank you. I have heard wonderful things about your foundation. His eyes never left the brooch. May I ask you something? I nodded before thinking. Where did you get that? His question was quiet. Simple. Yet something beneath the words carried a weight I could not understand. I glanced down at the silver piece resting against my shoulder. This? He gave a nearly invisible nod. Yes. I have had it for as long as I can remember. The silence between us stretched just long enough to become uncomfortable. Someone in your family gave it to you? I shook my head slowly. I do not really know. I was adopted when I was little. My parents always told me it was already with me. Something flickered across his face. Not disappointment. Not relief. Something far more complicated. He inhaled quietly before asking another question. How old were you? 5, maybe. The records from before then were incomplete. His eyes finally met mine. For one strange moment, it felt as though he was searching for an answer hidden somewhere behind my expression instead of listening to my words. I apologize, he said softly. I did not mean to make you uncomfortable. You did not. The answer came automatically, even though it was not entirely true. Before either of us could continue, another donor approached, smiling broadly as he greeted Adrian by name. The conversation shifted toward charity projects and museum acquisitions. Adrian responded with effortless professionalism, yet every few seconds I caught him looking back toward me, not with curiosity but with quiet certainty, as though the brief exchange had confirmed something he had spent years trying to find. I excused myself and walked toward the restoration studio behind the exhibition hall, telling myself I simply needed a moment alone. As the heavy wooden door closed behind me, I reached for the brooch once again. For the first time in my life, it no longer felt like a keepsake. It felt like a question waiting for an answer. The restoration studio had always been my favorite place in the gallery because old paintings never asked uncomfortable questions. They revealed their secrets only after patience, careful observation, and trust. People rarely worked that way. I closed the heavy wooden door behind me and rested both hands against the work table, willing my heartbeat to slow. Outside, the exhibition continued beneath crystal chandeliers and polished smiles. Inside, the familiar scent of aged canvas, wood polish, and restoration varnish wrapped around me like an old friend. I reached for the unfinished painting waiting beneath the conservation lamp, but my hands refused to stay steady. Every brushstroke I attempted drifted half an inch from where it belonged. I set the brush down with a quiet sigh. Something had changed tonight. I simply did not know what. My reflection stared back at me from the protective glass covering another artwork across the room. Same dark blonde hair pulled into a neat bun. Same simple black dress. Same silver brooch resting above my heart. It looked ordinary. It always had. Yet one question from a complete stranger had somehow transformed it into the most mysterious object I owned. I unclipped it carefully and turned it over in my palm. The pale blue stone caught the soft light, revealing tiny engraved vines surrounding the setting. I had examined it hundreds of times over the years without noticing anything unusual. This time my thumb brushed against the back, where an almost invisible line caught beneath my fingernail. Curious, I carried it beneath the magnifying lamp used for restoring miniature details. Under the brighter light, the faint scratch became something else entirely. Tiny letters. Nearly erased by decades of wear. I leaned closer until the symbols finally came into focus. A single capital V enclosed within a delicate crest. My breath caught. I had never seen that mark before. Or perhaps I had simply never looked closely enough. A gentle knock interrupted my thoughts. Before I could answer, the curator stepped inside wearing the same polite smile he seemed to wear every hour of every day. I hope I am not disturbing you. I quickly closed my hand around the brooch. Not at all. He glanced toward the ballroom before lowering his voice. Mr. Vaughn has already left, but before he departed he asked me something rather unusual. My stomach tightened. What was that? He wanted to know whether you had worked with the gallery before tonight. I frowned. That is an odd question. I thought so as well. When I explained that this was your first exhibition here, he simply thanked me and left. The curator smiled reassuringly. I suppose collectors become curious about talented artists. I forced a small smile in return, although I knew he had misunderstood. Adrian Vaughn had never once asked about my work. He had asked only about me. After the curator disappeared back into the celebration, I slipped the brooch into my handbag instead of pinning it back onto my dress. For the first time in more than 20 years, I did not feel comfortable wearing it where everyone could see. Nearly an hour later the exhibition finally ended. Guests filtered into waiting town cars while staff quietly dismantled floral arrangements and polished away fingerprints from display cases. I stepped outside carrying my coat against the cool Manhattan evening. A light breeze drifted between the buildings, carrying the distant sound of traffic and the faint scent of rain. Across the street, beneath the glow of a street lamp, a black sedan sat perfectly still. Its headlights remained off. The engine never started. I told myself it belonged to another guest. I told myself I was imagining things. Yet as I walked toward the subway entrance, I could not shake the feeling that someone inside that silent car was waiting for exactly one person to leave the gallery. Me. The black sedan was still there when I reached the subway entrance. I told myself not to look again, but curiosity has a quiet way of overpowering common sense. I glanced across the street just long enough to notice that the windshield reflected the city lights like polished glass, hiding whoever might have been inside. Then a taxi pulled between us, and when it drove away a few seconds later, the sedan was gone. I laughed softly at myself as I descended the station stairs. Manhattan had a way of making ordinary moments feel dramatic. Maybe I had simply spent too many years surrounded by paintings filled with hidden symbols and forgotten histories. The downtown train arrived with its familiar rush of wind. I found an empty seat near the window and watched the tunnels blur into dark ribbons beyond the glass. Usually the ride home helped me separate work from the rest of my life. Tonight every passing reflection reminded me of Adrian Vaughn's expression when he saw the brooch. Recognition. Not curiosity. Not admiration. Recognition. By the time I reached my apartment in Brooklyn, a light rain had begun falling, covering the sidewalks with silver reflections from the street lamps. My building was old enough to complain whenever the weather changed. The front door groaned. The stairwell creaked. Even the radiator inside my apartment greeted me with its familiar metallic clatter. Home was not elegant, but it was honest. I slipped off my shoes, hung my coat by the door, and placed the brooch carefully on the kitchen table beside a mug of untouched tea. The tiny crest engraved on the back seemed even more mysterious beneath the warm light of my apartment. I opened my laptop and searched every combination of words I could imagine. Antique silver floral brooch. Vintage blue stone crest. Decorative vine monogram. Hundreds of similar pieces appeared, but none matched mine. Finally, I searched only one letter. Capital V inside crest. Thousands of results filled the screen. Family emblems. Universities. Fashion brands. Historical archives. Nothing looked remotely familiar. Frustrated, I leaned back in my chair and rubbed my eyes. A soft notification chimed from my email. The sender was the gallery curator. I expected restoration notes or tomorrow's schedule. Instead, the message contained only a brief thank you for tonight's work and a reminder that one of the exhibition sponsors had expressed unusual interest in future conservation projects. Attached beneath the message was a scanned guest list from the evening. My eyes drifted automatically until they found his name. Adrian Vaughn. Below it appeared the name of his charitable foundation. Nothing unusual. Nothing mysterious. Yet something compelled me to search that name as well. Within seconds, articles began appearing across the screen. Business magazines praised his investments in museums, hospitals, and educational programs. Photographs showed him attending charity galas, standing beside city officials, smiling politely for cameras. Every headline described discipline, discretion, and influence. The more I read, the stranger our conversation felt. Public interviews revealed almost nothing personal. No family photographs. No discussion of childhood. No explanation for why a respected philanthropist had reacted so strongly to an old silver brooch owned by an art conservator he had never supposedly met. I closed the laptop and carried my tea to the window. Rain tapped gently against the glass while headlights drifted through the quiet street below. Then movement caught my attention. Parked across from my building sat another dark sedan. Maybe it was the same one. Maybe it was not. I could not tell from 4 stories above. The car remained perfectly still for nearly a minute before pulling away without ever stopping in front of another building. I stood frozen beside the window long after its taillights disappeared. For the second time that night, I had the unmistakable feeling that someone had found me long before I ever realized I was being searched for. Sleep should have come easily after a 14-hour day, but my mind refused to settle. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the tiny crest engraved on the back of the brooch and Adrian Vaughn's expression when he recognized it. Around 3 in the morning, the rain finally stopped. Silence settled over my apartment, broken only by the steady ticking of the old kitchen clock. I must have drifted asleep, because the next thing I remembered was sunlight spilling through the curtains and my alarm reminding me that another workday had already begun. I slipped the brooch into my handbag instead of pinning it to my dress. It felt safer hidden away, although I could not explain why. The gallery was unusually quiet when I arrived. Most of the exhibition pieces had already been transported back to their private collections, leaving empty display pedestals and carefully wrapped crates waiting for pickup. Restoration days were normally peaceful. I welcomed the routine. Dusting fragile frames, documenting repairs, and examining centuries-old brushstrokes required complete concentration. For several hours, I almost convinced myself that the previous evening had been nothing more than an unusual encounter. Then the receptionist appeared outside the conservation room holding a small envelope. "Claire, this was delivered about 15 minutes ago." I frowned. "For me?" She nodded. "No return address. The courier only said it had to reach you personally." After she left, I turned the cream-colored envelope over in my hands. My name had been written in neat black ink. Nothing else. No company logo. No postage stamp. Carefully, I opened the seal. Inside was a single cream card. The handwriting matched the envelope. "I hope my questions yesterday did not trouble you. If they did, I apologize. There is something I believe you deserve to know, but not until I am certain. Until then, please keep the silver brooch with you." No signature appeared beneath the message. None was necessary. I read the words 3 more times before placing the card back inside the envelope. It was not threatening. If anything, it sounded almost protective. That only made it more unsettling. During my lunch break, I could no longer ignore my curiosity. I called the adoption agency listed in my childhood records, hoping someone might still have archived information from nearly 23 years ago. After several transfers, an older woman answered with remarkable patience. She searched my file for several minutes before returning with an answer I had not expected. Miss Bennett, I am afraid most records from that period were lost during a system migration many years ago. Completely lost? I asked quietly. She hesitated. Not exactly. It appears portions of your file were removed before the archive was digitized. Removed by whom? I honestly cannot tell. There is no authorization listed. My fingers tightened around the phone. Is there anything left? Papers shuffled again. Only your intake date, estimated age, and one handwritten note. My heart began beating faster. What does it say? She read the sentence slowly. Child arrived with unidentified silver keepsake. Do not separate item from child under any circumstances. I closed my eyes. The words echoed through me long after she finished speaking. Is that all? Yes, Miss Bennett. I wish I had more. After we ended the call, I remained seated in the empty staff lounge staring at the envelope Adrian had sent that morning. Two completely unrelated people had given me the same instruction within 24 hours. Keep the brooch with you. For the first time, I stopped wondering why Adrian Vaughn recognized it. Instead, a far more unsettling question entered my mind. Who had gone to such extraordinary lengths to make certain it never left my possession? For the rest of the afternoon, I tried to lose myself in work, but concentration became impossible. Every painting I examined seemed to hide another layer beneath the surface, another story invisible until someone knew exactly where to look. I found myself wondering if people worked the same way. Perhaps we all carried invisible brushstrokes from lives we could no longer remember. When my shift finally ended, the gallery had already grown quiet again. The maintenance crew polished the marble floors while the last shipping crates disappeared through the loading entrance. I slipped the envelope from Adrian into my handbag beside the silver brooch and stepped outside into the cool evening air. The sky above Manhattan had turned pale gray, promising another night of rain. I decided to walk a few blocks before taking the subway. Fresh air usually helped untangle complicated thoughts. Tonight it only made me notice more. A man in a navy jacket stood outside a bookstore pretending to study his phone. 2 blocks later, the same man appeared reflected in a department store window behind me. Maybe it was coincidence. New York was full of familiar strangers. Still, I crossed the street without thinking. A minute later, I looked into another shop window. He had crossed as well. My pulse quickened, but I forced myself to keep walking at the same pace. Panicked people attracted attention. Calm people disappeared into crowds. At least that was what I kept telling myself. I ducked into a neighborhood coffee shop, more for reassurance than caffeine. The warm smell of roasted beans wrapped around me as I ordered a small latte and chose a table near the front window. Through the glass I watched pedestrians hurry home beneath umbrellas while yellow taxis rolled through the wet streets. The man never entered. Instead, another black sedan stopped briefly near the corner before continuing down the avenue. I reached into my bag and touched the brooch without removing it. Somehow that small piece of silver had become the center of everything happening around me. My phone vibrated softly across the table. The screen displayed an unknown number. I hesitated before answering. Hello? A calm male voice responded immediately. Miss Bennett, I hope I am not interrupting your evening. My heart skipped. I recognized the voice before he introduced himself. Mr. Vaughn. Please, Adrian. There was a brief pause filled only by the distant sound of traffic on his end of the line. I imagine you have many questions. That would be an understatement. His quiet laugh lasted barely a second. I expected as much. I looked through the cafe window again. have you been following me? Another pause. Longer this time. No, he answered carefully. But someone else has. A chill ran through me despite the warmth inside the cafe. What does that mean? It means I need you to listen carefully. If anything or anyone makes you uncomfortable tonight, do not confront them. Go somewhere public and stay there. Why? Because I still do not know who found you first. The sentence settled over me with unsettling weight. Before I could ask another question, he continued in the same measured tone. There are questions I cannot answer over the telephone. Not because I do not trust you, Claire. Because I do not yet know who might be listening. The line fell silent for a moment. Then he added something that made every conversation from the past 2 days suddenly feel connected. The brooch was never meant to be jewelry. It was meant to make sure the right person could recognize you. The call ended before I could say another word. I stared at my silent phone while the rain began tapping gently against the cafe window once again. Somewhere beyond the blurred reflections of passing headlights, someone knew exactly who I was. The only person who did not was me. My coffee had gone cold long before I realized I was still holding the cup. The sounds of the cafe slowly returned around me as though someone had turned the volume back on after muting the entire world. Cups clinked against saucers. An espresso machine hissed behind the counter. A couple near the window laughed about something neither of them would remember tomorrow. Ordinary life continued while mine had quietly slipped into something I no longer understood. I replayed Adrian's final sentence over and over inside my head. The brooch was never meant to be jewelry. It was meant to make sure the right person could recognize you. If that was true, then someone had expected me to be found one day. The question was why. I looked outside again. Rain painted soft silver lines across the glass, blurring every passing face into moving shadows. The man in the navy jacket was gone. The black sedan had disappeared as well. I told myself to stay calm, exactly as Adrian had instructed. After another 15 minutes, I paid for my untouched latte and walked toward the subway station, choosing streets lined with restaurants and evening shoppers instead of quieter side roads. Every reflection became a habit now. Store windows. Car doors. Office buildings. I caught myself checking each one without even thinking. By the time I reached my apartment building, the rain had become little more than a mist floating through the streetlights. Nothing looked unusual. My elderly neighbor, Mrs. Donnelly, was struggling with 2 grocery bags near the entrance. I hurried over to help her carry them inside. She smiled warmly as we climbed the stairs together. You always show up at the right moment, Claire. I laughed softly. Good timing, I guess. She looked at me for a second longer than usual. You look tired, dear. Do not let work steal all your smiles. I promised her I would rest, though we both knew I probably would not. Back inside my apartment, I locked the door and finally removed the brooch from my handbag. Instead of placing it on the kitchen table, I carried it beneath the bright conservation lamp I kept at home for freelance restoration projects. Adrian's words had changed the way I looked at it. This was no longer an accessory. It was evidence. I examined every edge with a jeweler's magnifying glass, following the engraved vines until I noticed something I had completely overlooked. One tiny leaf near the hinge moved slightly beneath gentle pressure. My breath caught as I carefully pressed it with the tip of a restoration tool. A nearly invisible compartment opened inside the brooch. It was no larger than the tip of my thumb. Empty. At first I felt disappointed. Then I realized something far more important. It had not always been empty. The tiny interior showed faint scratches, the kind left behind by something small that had been stored there for years before being removed. A folded note. A key. A photograph. I had no way of knowing. My phone buzzed across the table before I could examine it further. This time the number belonged to the gallery curator. Claire, I hope I am not disturbing you, he said apologetically. Not at all. Something was delivered after you left this evening. It is rather unusual. Another envelope? No. An appointment ledger from one of our retired restoration consultants. He insisted it belonged to you. Frankly, I do not understand why. Who is the consultant? Papers shuffled softly on his end of the call. His name is Arthur Whitmore. He retired almost 10 years ago. He specifically asked that you meet him tomorrow morning. He said there is something he has been waiting more than 2 decades to tell the young woman wearing the silver brooch. That night I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined the tiny hidden compartment inside the brooch and wondered what it had once protected. By sunrise, my apartment was filled with pale golden light, but it did little to quiet the questions racing through my mind. I arrived at the gallery nearly 45 minutes earlier than usual. The building felt completely different without the elegant crowds. The marble floors echoed beneath my footsteps, and the towering exhibition halls stood silent, waiting for the next collection to breathe life into them again. The receptionist greeted me with a curious smile. Mr. Whitmore has already arrived. He has been waiting since 8 o'clock. I checked my watch. It was only 8:15. Whoever this retired conservator was, punctuality clearly mattered to him. She directed me toward one of the private restoration workshops tucked away behind the museum archives. The room looked exactly how I imagined a lifetime of restoration would appear. Shelves overflowed with old journals, rolled blueprints, paint samples, magnifying lenses, and carefully labeled wooden drawers. Morning sunlight poured through tall windows, illuminating thousands of tiny dust particles floating peacefully in the air. An elderly man stood beside a large worktable, adjusting a pair of thin reading glasses. His silver hair was neatly combed, and despite his age, his posture remained remarkably straight. He looked up as I entered. His eyes immediately settled on my handbag. "You brought it," he said softly. I frowned. "The brooch?" He nodded once. "May I see it?" Something about his voice carried neither urgency nor curiosity. It sounded more like relief. I reached into my bag and carefully placed the silver brooch into his waiting hand. The moment his fingers touched the metal, he closed his eyes briefly before releasing a slow breath. I hoped I would live long enough to see this again. I remained silent. Arthur Whitmore turned the brooch over with practiced familiarity until his thumb found the hidden compartment. Unlike me, he opened it effortlessly. "You discovered the chamber last night." He smiled faintly. "Most people never would." He carried the brooch beneath an antique inspection lamp resting on his workbench. Instead of examining the hidden compartment, he studied the engraved vines surrounding the blue stone. "Do you know why restoration fascinates me, Claire?" I shook my head. "Because nothing truly disappears," he replied. "Time only hides it beneath newer layers." He reached into a nearby drawer and removed an old black and white photograph protected inside a clear archival sleeve. The edges had yellowed with age, but the image remained remarkably clear. It showed a formal charity gala held decades earlier. Elegant guests filled an enormous ballroom beneath crystal chandeliers that looked strangely familiar. My eyes drifted across the faces until Arthur pointed toward a young woman standing near the center. She wore a graceful ivory evening gown. Fastened above her heart rested a silver brooch with a pale blue stone. The same one I had carried my entire life. "Who is she?" I whispered. Arthur looked at me for a long moment before answering. "That is Eleanor Vaughan." The surname struck me immediately. Vaughan. The same family name Adrian carried. My heartbeat quickened. Was she related to him? Arthur nodded slowly. She was his older sister. The room suddenly felt smaller. I looked back at the photograph, unable to pull my eyes away from the smiling young woman wearing my brooch. "That cannot be possible," I whispered. "Then why do I have it?" Arthur's expression filled with quiet sadness. "That," he said gently, "is exactly the question someone spent more than 20 years making sure you would eventually ask." Arthur Whitmore did not speak again for several seconds. He simply allowed the silence to settle between us, the way experienced restorers sometimes stepped back from a painting to see the entire picture before touching another brushstroke. My eyes remained fixed on the faded photograph. The woman wearing my brooch looked graceful and confident, the kind of person who belonged in grand ballrooms beneath crystal chandeliers instead of existing as a mystery trapped inside an old photograph. Eleanor Vaughn, I repeated quietly, almost testing whether saying her name aloud would make any of this feel real. Arthur nodded. She cared deeply about preserving history. We worked together on several restoration projects before she disappeared from public life. One word caught my attention immediately. Disappeared? He folded the photograph carefully before placing it back inside its protective sleeve. That is how the newspapers described it. Families often choose simpler words than complicated truths. I sat across from him without taking my eyes off the brooch resting beneath the inspection lamp. Did Adrian know her well? A gentle smile appeared on Arthur's face. He adored his sister. He was only a young boy, but wherever Eleanor went, he tried to follow. She encouraged his curiosity. She believed beautiful things should never be hidden away where only wealthy people could admire them. The image of the composed man I had met at the gallery suddenly shifted in my mind. For the first time, I could imagine him as a child instead of an untouchable businessman. Arthur opened another drawer and removed an aging leather journal. The pages had yellowed with time, their edges softened by decades of careful handling. He turned several pages before stopping near the center. This is one of Eleanor's restoration notebooks. She often sketched decorative objects she hoped to preserve. My breath caught as he rotated the journal toward me. There, drawn with remarkable precision, was the silver brooch. Every engraved vine. Every delicate curve. Even the hidden compartment had been illustrated in cross-section. Beneath the drawing Eleanor had written a single sentence in elegant handwriting. Some treasures are meant to protect people, not possessions. I read the words twice before looking up. She designed it? Arthur slowly shook his head. No. She inherited it. Then why did it end up with me? His expression became thoughtful. That is the part one cannot answer with certainty. He reached into the journal and carefully removed a folded sheet of archival paper tucked between the pages. This, however, may help. He unfolded the fragile document with extraordinary care. It was an old visitor registry from a children's charity exhibition held more than 20 years earlier. Most of the names meant nothing to me until Arthur pointed near the bottom of the page. Eleanor Vaughn. Just below her signature appeared another entry written only 15 minutes later. Claire. No last name. No address. Just Claire in uneven handwriting that looked unmistakably like the uncertain printing of a young child learning to write. I stared at the page until the letters blurred. That cannot be mine, I whispered, though something deep inside me already knew otherwise. Arthur looked at me with quiet compassion. You once met Eleanor, Claire. Whether either of you understood how important that meeting would become is another question entirely. Before I could respond, someone knocked gently on the workshop door. Arthur glanced toward the entrance, his calm expression changing for the first time since I had arrived. Right on time, he murmured. The door opened, and Adrian Vaughn stepped quietly into the room. His eyes met mine first, then drifted toward the visitor registry still lying open on the table. Without looking away from me, he spoke only 6 words, each one carrying the weight of years. You remember nothing, do you? His question settled over the room with surprising gentleness. There was no accusation in Adrian's voice. Only quiet disappointment, as though he had spent years hoping for a different answer. I looked from him to Arthur and then back to the visitor registry still resting on the work table. No, I admitted. I do not remember any of this. Adrian nodded once, almost as if he had prepared himself for that response long before walking through the door. He approached slowly, stopping beside the inspection lamp where the silver brooch reflected the morning sunlight. You were 5 years old, he said. Memory is fragile at that age, especially after a life changes overnight. Arthur quietly gathered the journals and photographs, giving us space without actually leaving the room. He understood that some conversations needed witnesses, while others simply needed silence. Adrian rested one hand lightly on the edge of the table. The charity exhibition in that registry was organized by my sister. She believed every child deserved to experience beauty, no matter where they came from. Paintings, music, history. She thought they could change lives. I looked again at the small handwritten name on the registry. Claire. So she met me there. Yes. His answer came immediately. You spent nearly an hour following her through the gallery. I blinked in surprise. How could you possibly remember that? A faint smile crossed his face, the first genuine one I had seen since meeting him. Because I spent that same hour following both of you. The image formed slowly inside my mind. A little boy trailing behind an older sister. A little girl wandering through a museum she had never seen before. It felt strangely familiar, like a melody I almost recognized but could not quite remember. Adrian reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket and removed a carefully protected photograph. Unlike the formal image Arthur had shown me, this one captured an ordinary moment. Eleanor knelt beside a small easel, smiling warmly at a young girl holding a paintbrush covered in bright blue paint. Off to one side stood a dark-haired boy with his arms folded, pretending not to smile while secretly watching both of them. My breath caught. The little girl wore the same silver brooch pinned awkwardly to the front of her tiny sweater. That is me, I whispered. Adrian nodded. And that stubborn little boy is me. I stared at the photograph until the edges blurred. Something stirred inside me. Not a complete memory. Just fragments. Warm sunlight through tall windows. The scent of fresh paint. Gentle laughter. Someone kneeling to straighten my crooked brooch before telling me that beautiful things should always be cared for. I pressed my fingertips against my temple. The feeling disappeared almost as quickly as it had arrived. I almost remembered something. Adrian's expression softened instead of brightening. Do not force it. Memories are like old paintings. Push too hard and you damage what is still there. Arthur smiled quietly from across the workshop. That sounds exactly like something Eleanor used to say. Adrian lowered his eyes for a moment before continuing. After that exhibition, my sister spent months trying to find you again. She believed you had been separated from someone important. She never explained why she felt so certain. Did she ever find me? I asked. His silence answered before his words did. No. Every trail ended the same way. Missing records. Altered files. Closed doors. He looked directly into my eyes, his voice calm but unmistakably sincere. Until the night I walked into that gallery and saw the brooch again, I believed I had lost both my sister's promise and the little girl she never stopped searching for. The room remained silent long after Adrian finished speaking. I looked down at the faded photograph resting between us, tracing the smiling faces with my eyes as though I could somehow reach through time and ask them what had happened next. I wanted to remember. More than anything, I wanted to remember. Instead, my mind offered only scattered fragments that disappeared the moment I tried to hold on to them. Arthur quietly closed Eleanor's journal and slid it back into the archival box. Memories rarely return all at once, he said gently. Sometimes they arrive because the heart is ready before the mind is. Adrian nodded in agreement but said nothing. He seemed content to let the silence exist without rushing to fill it. That surprised me. Ever since I had learned his name, I had imagined a man who controlled every conversation. Instead, the person standing before me understood patience better than most people I had ever met. I finally broke the silence. If Eleanor searched for me all those years ago, why did everyone stop? Adrian looked toward the tall workshop windows where the morning light continued spilling across the wooden floor. Because every document connected to you vanished. Every institution claimed they had incomplete records. Every trail ended the same way. Eventually my sister accepted that someone wanted your past to remain hidden. He paused before continuing. She never accepted that you were gone forever. Arthur reached into another storage drawer and removed a slim archival folder sealed with a faded ribbon. There is one more thing she left behind. He handed it to Adrian instead of me. Adrian hesitated only briefly before opening it. Inside rested a single handwritten letter folded into thirds. The paper had yellowed with age, but the elegant handwriting remained perfectly preserved. Adrian looked at the first page for several seconds before quietly handing it to me. She wanted the person who carried the brooch to read this someday. My hands trembled as I unfolded the letter. The ink had softened over the years, yet every word remained beautifully clear. If you are reading this, then life has finally brought you back to the story you were never meant to lose. Do not be afraid of what you cannot remember. Memory protects us until truth becomes something we are strong enough to carry. The people who truly cared for you never searched because they wished to own your future. They searched because they hoped you would one day choose it for yourself. I stopped reading for a moment, blinking away unexpected tears. Eleanor's words did not feel like instructions. They felt like kindness preserved across decades. I continued reading until I reached the final sentence. When the day comes that you discover who you were, do not let that stop you from becoming who you still wish to be. I folded the letter carefully and looked at Adrian. She believed I would come back. He smiled with quiet certainty. She believed hope deserved patience. Before I could answer, Arthur's office telephone rang from the far corner of the workshop. He excused himself and answered in a low voice. At first his expression remained calm. Then it slowly changed. His shoulders stiffened. The warmth disappeared from his face. After only a few seconds, he thanked the caller and gently returned the receiver to its cradle. He turned toward us with unusual seriousness. Someone has been requesting access to the museum archives all morning, he said. They specifically asked whether the restoration workshop contained any materials connected to Eleanor Vaughn. Adrian's expression did not change, but his eyes became noticeably more focused. Arthur looked directly at me before quietly adding the detail that made the room feel suddenly smaller. They also knew your name before anyone here had spoken it aloud. Arthur's words settled over the workshop like dust drifting through morning sunlight. Nobody spoke immediately. The quiet hum of the conservation lamp suddenly seemed louder than before, and somewhere beyond the closed door, I could hear distant footsteps echoing through the museum corridors. I instinctively reached for the silver brooch resting on the table, wrapping my fingers around it as though it had become an anchor instead of a mystery. Adrian noticed the gesture but said nothing. His attention remained fixed on Arthur. Did they leave a name? Arthur slowly shook his head. No. The caller identified himself only as a private researcher. Adrian's expression remained calm, yet I sensed him weighing every word. That is not why you look concerned. Arthur sighed softly. Because he knew details that are not available to the public. He knew Eleanor donated personal restoration journals to this workshop. He knew about today's meeting. Most importantly, he knew Claire arrived this morning before any staff member recorded her entry. A chill traveled through me. How could anyone know that? Arthur spread his hands helplessly. I wish I had an answer. Adrian finally turned toward me. His voice stayed measured and reassuring. Claire, I need you to understand something. Curiosity alone does not explain this anymore. I searched his face. Then what does? Someone has been following the same trail we have. I expected fear to rise inside me. Instead, something unexpected took its place. Resolve. For days I had allowed unanswered questions to control every decision. I had waited for strangers to explain my own life. I looked down at Eleanor's letter still resting beside the photograph. Her final sentence echoed quietly inside my mind. Do not let your past decide your future. I folded the letter with careful hands and placed it inside my handbag next to the brooch. I am tired of waiting for answers to arrive, I said. If someone else is searching for the truth, then I want to know what they think they are looking for. Adrian studied me for several seconds before the slightest smile appeared. That sounds exactly like Eleanor. Arthur laughed gently under his breath. I was about to say the same thing. The warmth of that small moment dissolved much of the tension filling the room. For the first time since all of this had begun, I no longer felt like an outsider listening to someone else's story. Somehow, quietly, it had become mine. Arthur walked toward a locked filing cabinet in the corner of the workshop and removed a small archival storage box. Unlike the journals, this one contained no documents. Inside rested a polished brass key attached to a faded ivory tag. Across the tag, written in Eleanor's unmistakable handwriting, were 4 simple words. For Claire, when ready. I stared at the key in disbelief. She left this for me? Arthur nodded. She instructed me never to release it unless the young woman wearing the brooch found her own way back. Adrian picked up the tag and turned it over. On the reverse side was a handwritten address in upstate New York. I recognized the town immediately. It was famous for its historic estates and preserved gardens, places where time seemed to move more slowly than the rest of the world. What is there? I asked quietly. Arthur smiled with quiet certainty. The restoration studio Eleanor built before she disappeared from public life. It has remained untouched ever since. Adrian looked from the brass key to me. If she left anything behind that explains your connection to her, I believe we will find it there. I closed my fingers around the cool metal key, feeling its surprising weight settle into my palm. For the first time since I had walked into the gallery that evening, I no longer felt like I was chasing scattered pieces of someone else's memory. I finally had a direction, and somewhere beyond that old studio waited the answer Eleanor had trusted time itself to protect. 3 days later, the autumn sun rose over the Hudson River as Adrian and I drove north toward the address Eleanor had left behind. The city slowly disappeared in the rearview mirror, replaced by winding roads lined with brilliant maple trees painted in shades of gold and crimson. For most of the journey, neither of us spoke very much. Strangely, the silence no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt earned. Sometimes trust arrived the same way old paintings revealed hidden colors, quietly and without asking permission. By late morning, we reached a weathered stone estate overlooking a wide meadow. Time had touched every corner of the property, but it had never stolen its dignity. Ivy climbed the walls. White roses bloomed beneath tall windows. Wind stirred gently through ancient oak trees that had probably witnessed generations come and go. Adrian unlocked the front gate with Eleanor's brass key. The lock turned smoothly, as though it had been waiting for this exact moment. Inside, the restoration studio remained almost exactly as Arthur had described. Sunlight streamed through enormous skylights onto polished wooden tables covered with neatly arranged brushes, pigments, magnifying lenses, and unfinished conservation sketches. Dust rested gently across every surface, yet nothing felt abandoned. It felt preserved. As if someone believed the work would continue one day. I walked slowly through the room until I reached a large easel positioned beneath the brightest window. Resting upon it was an unfinished painting protected beneath a linen cloth. Carefully, I lifted the fabric away. My breath caught. It was not a landscape or a portrait of some important historical figure. It was a painting of a little girl standing inside a museum gallery, wearing a tiny silver brooch over her sweater while smiling towards someone outside the frame. The resemblance was unmistakable. It was me. Tears blurred my vision before I even realized they had formed. Beside the easel rested one final envelope bearing Eleanor's elegant handwriting. Claire. Adrian quietly stepped back, giving me the space to open it alone. Inside was a letter written shortly before the ink of time had begun to fade. My dear Claire, if these words have reached you, then hope has fulfilled the promise that time could not erase. You were never chosen because of your name, your past, or your circumstances. You were chosen because kindness remained in your heart even after life gave you every reason to lose it. I met many important people, but very few reminded me that true elegance belongs to those who quietly lift others without asking for recognition. Never measure your life by what was taken from you. Measure it by what you continue giving despite it. I lowered the letter, unable to hold back the tears any longer. They were not tears of sadness. They were tears of recognition. Not because I had recovered every missing memory, but because I finally understood something far more important. My identity had never been hidden inside forgotten documents or sealed archives. It had been quietly reflected in every choice I had made without knowing why. Every painting I restored. Every stranger I helped. Every broken piece I believed deserved another chance. Adrian stood beside me, looking at the unfinished portrait for a long moment before speaking. She finished restoring people better than paintings. I smiled through my tears. She never stopped restoring either. He carefully removed the silver brooch from my hand and fastened it once again above my heart. This time it no longer felt like a question. It felt like a promise finally understood. Outside, the afternoon light filled the old studio with warmth as leaves drifted gently across the open meadow. Nothing about the past had changed. The missing years remained missing. The unanswered questions would always exist. Yet somehow they no longer carried the same weight. I had spent my life believing beauty meant perfection, untouched and flawless. Eleanor had taught me something far greater. The most unforgettable things are not the ones that escape time. They are the ones that carry every mark of their journey and still choose to shine.